Today, I will tell you a story, one that was never meant to be spoken aloud. It is said to come from a scroll hidden beneath centuries of dust, a record of truths too heavy for the living to carry. So listen carefully, for this is not myth, it is memory. And now, we begin. The chroniclers of Israel wrote much, yet they did not write everything. Beneath the stone courts of Solomon's sanctuary, deeper than the vaults that held gold and censers, lay a silence no priest dared to name. Some called it the chamber of the first light. Others whispered a darker title, the room where God never spoke. It was sealed long before the temple's dedication, its entrance hidden beneath a slab of limestone carved with no symbols, no blessing, no warning, as though even writing upon it would invite judgment. Only the oldest scribes knew it existed, and they guarded its memory with oaths heavier than the ark itself, for they said a remnant of something ancient slept there, not a relic, not a scroll, a presence. The scroll from which this account survives, brittle, ochre-colored, its edges devoured by time, speaks of a night when the youngest temple watchman heard a sound beneath the floor stones, not footsteps, not breath, something like a voice trying to remember how to speak. He told no one, for in those days the temple glowed with glory, but its shadows grew long. Ancient rumors said Solomon did not build the sanctuary alone. At the edges of dawn, when stars bled into pale fire, a visitor of terrible brightness entered the unfinished courts. Some called him an angel. Others feared he was a remnant of the Watchers, one of those who once descended in the days of Jared. This being carved the hidden chamber, its walls marked with a script unknown to Hebrews, Syrians, or Egyptians, a language of light and sorrow, a language men were never meant to hear. What did Solomon see there? The scroll does not say. It only records that he emerged pale, trembling, and silent. After that night, he ordered the chambers sealed forever, but the presence remained, and the scribes who passed down this account warn of a truth deeper still, that whatever sleeps beneath the sanctuary was planted there before Solomon's birth, before David's reign, before Israel entered the land. Some say it is a memory of Eden, others the echo of a judgment yet to come. But the scroll gives it one name only, the first shadow, and with this name, our story descends into the depths. The scroll continues with a passage so faint that the ink seems to have fled from the page, as though refusing to recount what happened next. Yet what remains is enough to trouble the soul. It speaks of a night during the Feast of Trumpets, when the temple courts glimmered with oil lamps and the songs of Levites rose like pillars of light. But beneath that holy music, under the weight of polished marble and cedar beams, something shifted in the deep. Not a tremor, not the settling of stone. A pulse, the watchman who felt it, the same young man who once heard the voice, later confessed that the ground beneath his sandals grew warm, as if a hidden heart beat slowly in the darkness below. He dared not kneel, for he knew the stories. No servant of the sanctuary touched his face to the earth unless God himself commanded it. Yet the pulse came again, stronger. He fled from his post, but the sound followed him, a low tone, mournful and ancient, neither human nor angelic. It echoed in the stone walls as if the temple itself were remembering an old grief. The scribes who preserved the scroll offer a chilling explanation. They wrote that the sealed chamber was not a prison, but a boundary, a sacred line drawn by Solomon, not to confine the presence beneath, but to protect Israel from hearing its full voice. For they claimed this presence was older than the temple, older than the ark, older than the covenant, carved in fire atop Sinai. The scroll calls it the echo that precedes light, a remnant from the hour when creation trembled, when the heavens were stretched like a veil, and the first command of God split eternity. Some believed it was the sound that angels feared, the residue of a divine word not fully spoken. Others whispered another theory, that this echo belonged to a being who once stood before the throne, radiant and loyal, before pride darkened his wings. The chroniclers do not name him. They dared not. But they record that Solomon, upon learning who or what slept beneath the sanctuary, wept so fiercely that his tears stained the limestone. He ordered that the chamber be sealed with stone, untouched by chisel or hammer, as if human hands were unworthy to touch that threshold. Yet, even sealed, the presence stirred whenever Israel strayed. During the days when the king grew enthralled with foreign altars, the pulse grew louder. During the years of peace, it stilled. And during the darkest nights of idolatry, the voice beneath the temple sang with a sound like cracking stars. One scribe described it with trembling words. It was the music of a world that had forgotten its maker. And on this night of trumpets, when the watchman felt that pulse again, he realized the truth no priest dared utter. The presence knew Israel's sins and remembered them one by one. For this was no guardian, no relic, no remaining angelic servant. This was something else entirely. And its awakening had only begun. The scroll turns darker here, as though the chronicler's hand trembled while writing. The ink grows heavier, the strokes uneven, as if the words themselves resisted being born. It tells of a scribe named Matanya, the only man in Solomon's court, who knew how to read the inscriptions etched into the hidden chamber's walls, not because he had learned them, but because the symbols recognized him. He was a quiet man, pale and thin, with eyes that seemed always fixed on something far beyond the horizon. Some whispered he was born with a veil over his sight. Others said angels touched him in the womb. No one knew the truth, not even Solomon. But the king trusted him. And so, when the temple trembled on the Feast of Trumpets, when the pulse beneath the sanctuary made even the bronze pillars quiver, Solomon summoned Matanya in secret. They met at dawn, when the smoke of the sacrifices rose like gray fingers twisting through the air. Solomon spoke quietly, for even his voice seemed too loud. "Tell me," he said, "what stirs beneath us?" Matanya did not answer at once. Instead, he placed his ear to the cold floor stones. The chronicler records that tears began to fall from his eyes, not out of fear, but recognition. Then he whispered, "It remembers the covenant." Solomon's face grew pale. But it was sealed. It was bound. It was forbidden. Matanya shook his head. Nothing bound by man can silence what was known before man existed. He then said something more, a sentence nearly scratched out in the scroll, as though later scribes wished to blot it from existence. "It hears the prayers we do not pray, and judges the ones we do." That same night, Matanya descended alone into the forbidden chamber. The priests thought he had gone to his quarters. The guards thought he walked the upper courts. But the chroniclers write that he lifted the limestone slab with hands that should not have had the strength, as though the stone itself obeyed him. He carried no lamp, no torch, no offering, only a reed scroll and a stylus of iron. The chamber swallowed him, and the entrance sealed behind him as though the stone remembered its place. What he saw there is not fully preserved. The scroll's ink dissolves in several places, the words eaten away like ash in wind, but a few lines remain, enough to chill the bones. It says, Matanya stepped into a darkness that did not behave like darkness, a darkness that moved with the slow breath of something alive. And on the walls glimmered symbols that shifted like embers, as though fire and shadow argued over their meaning. He approached the center of the chamber, where the air trembled with a low, ancient hum, and then he heard it, a whisper, a single phrase, a voice that had not spoken since before the first angel fell. "You have come to remember me." The scribes note that Matanya fell to his knees, not in worship, but in unbearable recognition, for he understood who spoke. And he knew that Israel had built its holiest sanctuary upon a forgotten throne, a throne of someone heaven had expelled, someone who had once ruled in radiance, someone who waited beneath the temple not in chains, but in expectation. The surviving portion of the scroll reveals that Matanya did not flee the chamber. He could not. For the moment the voice spoke, the air thickened like water, and the darkness around him rippled with the weight of something vast remembering itself. The chronicler writes that the chamber's walls began to glow, not with fire, but with memory. The symbols carved into the stone unfurled like waking serpents of light, reshaping themselves into words older than the Torah, older than the stars. Matanya recognized fragments of the language. He had seen it once before, in a dream he never dared to describe, a dream he believed came from God. But now he understood the terrible truth. It had not come from God at all. The inscriptions told a story no priest would have allowed to exist, the story of a being who once walked in the courts of heaven, robed in light, shaped like living flame, a being entrusted with the foundations of creation, a being whose voice had once formed the pillars of dawn. But pride hardened his radiance. Ambition rotted his song. And the heavens tore his name away like flesh from bone. The inscriptions described his fall with sorrow, not rage, as though heaven mourned him even as it cast him out. Beneath the temple, Matanya realized, lay a throne that had once been his, a throne now drowned in shadow, its occupant stripped of glory, yet not stripped of presence. The chronicler writes, he was not sleeping, he was waiting. Matanya, trembling, dared to speak. Why here? Why beneath the temple of the Most High? The voice answered, its whisper shaking dust from the ceiling, because Solomon invited me. The scribe staggered backward. He remembered the legends, the king's desperate hunger for wisdom, his bargaining with powers unseen, his willingness to speak with spirits older than man's memory. Solomon had sought understanding deeper than the prophets, and he had opened a door no prophet would have touched. The voice continued, he did not know my name. Even now, few remember it, but the throne remembers. A rumble passed through the chamber, faint, but enough to cause the limestone to shiver like living muscle. Matanya pressed his palm to the ground and felt the pulse again, stronger than before. The presence was waking, and with awakening came hunger, not for worship, but for recognition. For every memory erased in heaven still lived in the stones beneath Israel's holiest sanctuary. Matanya whispered, barely able to breathe, "If you rise, the temple will fall." The voice replied, "It will fall regardless, but not before my shadow walks its courts one last time." The chronicler ends the section with a line that later scribes scratched almost completely away, leaving only fragments, and Matanya understood that the greatest danger was not that the presence beneath the temple would rise, but that someone above would help it. For there were men in Israel who sought power more fiercely than Solomon ever had, and one of them was already listening. The scroll's next section begins with a warning written in trembling strokes. "Fear not the shadow below, but the man above who seeks its breath." For as Matanya descended into the sealed chamber, another figure moved through the silent corridors of the temple, a man whose name the scribes refused to preserve. They called him only the Listener. He was a priest of high rank, outwardly righteous, clothed in linen and gold, beloved by the people for his flawless recitations of the law. But beneath the robes lived a hunger deeper than reverence, a hunger for mysteries that even the prophets did not touch. He, too, had felt the pulse beneath the sanctuary. He, too, had heard the faint hum rising like a buried heartbeat. But unlike Matanya, he did not fear it. He desired it. The chronicler records that the listener crept down the outer stairway at the edge of dawn, moving like a man guided by a voice only he could hear. His sandals made no sound. His breath was shallow. And when he reached the ancient limestone slab, he found, to his astonishment, that it was already open. A faint current of cold air rose from the darkness below, carrying with it a scent not earthly, something like burned cedar mixed with the sweetness of crushed myrrh, a scent of worship old enough to predate Israel. The listener's eyes widened. He knew at once someone had entered the forbidden chamber, and he knew who. He whispered Matanya's name with a mixture of pity and triumph, for he had long envied the scribe's strange gift, the way the king trusted him, the way the old scrolls seemed to bend their secrets toward him. But now he believed those secrets could be his. The chronicler writes, "Jealousy is a door. Through it, shadows walk freely." He stepped onto the top stair. Below, he heard a voice, not Matanya's, but something vast speaking in a language so ancient it felt like memory itself. The listener froze. His heart stuttered, for the voice was not loud, yet it carried weight enough to bow the soul. But instead of recoiling, he whispered, "Speak again." And the darkness replied, not with words, but with a tone that wrapped around him like a serpent of warmth and promise. He descended. Each step carried him deeper into a realm where torches could not burn, and sound moved like slow water. The walls breathed, the floor shivered, and at the chamber's threshold he saw Matanya kneeling, not in devotion, but in awe-stricken terror. In the center of the chamber, a dim glow pulsed like the dying ember of a star. The listeners stepped forward. Matanya turned sharply, eyes wide with dread. "Do not enter," he hissed. "You cannot stand before it." But the listener smiled, a thin, triumphant smile. "You speak with the voice of fear," he said. "I speak with the voice of calling." The presence stirred. The glow brightened, and the chamber filled with a heat that felt like the sun rising underground. The listener lowered his head in reverence, not to God, but to the throne beneath the throne. "What would you have me do?" he whispered, and the presence answered him with a single ripple of sound that cracked the stone at his feet. A command, a covenant, a promise. The chronicler writes only this: on that day, the shadow beneath the temple gained its first servant, and Israel gained a danger more terrible than the presence itself. A man willing to open the door. What happened next in the chamber was preserved only in broken lines, as though later scribes tried to erase it. But the parchment refused to forget. The listener knelt before the dim, pulsing glow. Matanya knelt in terror, and the presence, ancient, fallen, remembering itself, awakened further with each breath drawn in the darkness. The scroll says, "A covenant was offered, a man accepted, and heaven trembled." Matanya felt the air around him thicken until each breath tasted like smoke and iron. The listener, however, breathed freely, almost joyfully. It was as though the presence shaped the chamber to welcome him. The glow expanded, revealing for the first time the object at the center of the room, a low stone dais carved in a pattern no Hebrew had ever seen. It was circular, layered with concentric marks that resembled both the rings of a tree and the ripples of a lake. In its center lay a depression, smooth and shallow, a throne not for a body, but for light itself. The listener approached it. Matanya cried out, but his voice died in his throat as the presence turned its attention fully upon the priest, not in wrath, but in recognition. A whisper filled the chamber, rising from the dais like smoke, rising from a brazier. "You hear me. You desire me. You remember what heaven forgot." The listener bowed deeply. "Teach me," he whispered, "and I will serve." And the presence answered, "Then stand." Matanya watched in horror as the glow coiled upward like a serpent of fire, touching the listener's forehead with a single thread of light. The priest gasped, not in pain, but in ecstasy. His body shuddered, his eyes rolled back, and a mark appeared on his skin, faint and red, shaped like the first letter of the old inscriptions that lined the walls. The chronicler describes it as a sigil of remembrance, a sign that the presence had chosen him. The chamber shifted. The walls hummed with new resonance. The floor trembled like a drumskin struck by a giant hand. Even the ceiling dripped with soft dust, as though the temple above had felt the touch of something forbidden. Matanya reached for the listener's arm. "Stop. You do not know what you invite." But the listener's face twisted into something unrecognizable, a mixture of exaltation and hunger. "I invite what God denied us," he said, "knowledge beyond prophets, wisdom beyond kings, power beyond angels." The presence pulsed once, and the chamber obeyed his words. Symbols on the walls ignited in crimson light. The air turned warm, almost tender. The sigil on the listener's forehead glowed with a heat that lit his eyes from within. And somewhere in the darkness above, a deep rumble passed through the earth like distant thunder, a warning from a God whose patience was not infinite. Matanya shielded his face. "If you serve it," he whispered, trembling, "you betray heaven." The listener did not turn, did not blink, did not hesitate. "Heaven abandoned me long ago," he said. Then the presence spoke a final command, one that cracked the chamber's threshold, split a vein through the temple floor above, and sent a shiver through every soul in Jerusalem. "Open the gate." The covenant was complete. The listener was chosen, and the first step toward the temple's doom had been taken. The scroll says the earth did not shake merely from weight or movement, but from recognition, as though the temple itself understood what had just begun beneath it. Matanya staggered backward, hands pressed to his ears. The listener stood upright and still, like a man enthralled by music no one else could hear. And the presence pulsed once, sending a wave of warm, trembling air through the chamber. The chronicler writes, "The command was not to open a door of stone, but a door of remembrance." The listener lifted his marked hand. Immediately, the symbols on the chamber's walls rippled like ink dissolving in water. They peeled away from the stone and hovered in the air as crimson fragments of light. They circled the listener like a crown of shifting letters, each one radiating quiet sorrow, the sorrow of a voice long denied. Matanya understood the truth. The gate the presence demanded was not physical. It was the heart of Israel, the place where memory and covenant intertwined. By marking the listener, the presence had found a way to rise without breaking the stone seal. It would rise through men, through choices, through those who believed they could serve two masters. Matanya shouted over the trembling air, "Stop before you doom us all." But the listener did not see doom. He saw destiny. His voice echoed with unnatural calm. "This being knows power greater than prophets. Why should Israel fear knowledge that heaven hides?" Matanya shook his head violently, "Because not all knowledge is gift. Some is wound." The listener placed his palm over the glowing sigil on his forehead and whispered, "Then let it cut." With that, he extended both hands toward the hovering symbols, and they rushed into him like a breath of fire. His body arched, his teeth clenched. Light poured from his eyes like molten gold. The chronicler describes this moment with a single line. And the gate opened, not in heaven, not on earth, but in the soul of a man. The chamber changed instantly. The glow dimmed, as though the presence had withdrawn into deeper shadow. The air cooled. The trembling ceased. And for the first time since Solomon sealed it, the chamber grew still, as though the presence had passed its burden to another. The listener exhaled sharply and lowered his head. When he lifted it, his eyes were no longer those of a priest. They were lit by a quiet, terrible purpose. Matanya backed away. "What has it shown you?" The listener answered with a smile that did not belong to any mortal. "The temple is built on a forgotten throne. It must be reminded of its first master." Matanya felt his heart collapse inside him. The listener stepped closer, voice soft as dust. "Heaven cast him out, but earth still remembers. And through me, the kingdom beneath the sanctuary will breathe again." Then, as lightly as a man brushing aside a curtain, the listener walked past Matanya and ascended the stairs, leaving the chamber still sealed, but no longer silent. The chronicler ends this section with a chilling line. The presence no longer waited below. It walked in the courts of men. And Jerusalem, though it did not yet know it, stood on the edge of a calamity older than prophecy. When the listener emerged from the depths beneath the temple, no guard challenged him. No priest questioned him. No scribe paused at the sight of his trembling hands. The chronicler writes that he walked through Solomon's courts as a man wearing another man's memory. His steps guided not by sight, but by command. Something unseen moved with him, not beside him, not behind him, but within him, like a pulse that did not belong to flesh. In the sunlit courtyards, Worshippers lifted their hands in prayer, unaware that the air around them had changed. A faint warmth drifted in the breeze, a warmth that did not come from incense or sacrifice. The listener breathed it in with reverence. He whispered, "You are no longer forgotten." The scroll says that on that morning the temple's shadows behaved strangely. They stretched against the light. They reached toward the columns. They bent upward instead of down. Only one man noticed, Matanya. He had followed the listener at a distance, his heart pounding, his mind racing through every scripture he had ever read. The words of the prophets felt suddenly small, warnings too narrow for what now lived in the body of a priest. He watched the listener cross the courtyard, and for a moment Matanya thought he saw a second silhouette behind him, a darker one, a taller one, one whose wings were not wings, but flowing bands of shifting night. He blinked, and it vanished. The listener approached the altar of burnt offering. The priests there bowed, for he spoke with authority, too much authority. He placed his hands upon the altar's edge, and the bronze warmed beneath his fingers. A ripple of heat rose through the air. The flame flickered, shuddered, then leaned toward him as though drawn by memory. Matanya gasped, "He is bending the sacred fire." The listener heard him. He turned slowly, and when his eyes met Matanya's, they glowed faintly, like embers buried beneath ash. He raised a single finger to his lips. Silence. The command struck Matanya harder than a blow. His knees bent. His voice died in his throat. And for a terrible moment, he felt the presence beneath the listener's skin staring through him. A cold intelligence watching, remembering, judging. Then the listener turned away as though Matanya no longer mattered. He began to speak to the priests. The chronicler managed to preserve fragments of his sermon. Wisdom hidden from generations. A throne beneath the throne. A light heaven rejected, but earth may embrace. The priests were stunned. Some were fearful. Some were enthralled. But one thing was clear. The listener spoke with a power not his own. And with each word, the presence within him tested the boundaries of the temple, stretching, probing, seeking the cracks in Israel's devotion. Matanya watched helplessly. Every sentence the listener uttered was a seed. Every seed was a door. And through each door, the ancient presence reached upward, tasting the air of the sanctuary for the first time in ages. The chronicler writes, "The shadow beneath the temple no longer needed its chamber. It had found a sanctuary in the hearts of men." But the true horror was yet to come. For that afternoon, Solomon himself would enter the courts, and the listener was already waiting for him. The sun had begun its slow descent, laying long bars of gold across the temple courtyard when Solomon entered. The chronicler says the king walked with the heaviness of a man who sensed danger but could not yet name it. His robe brushed the ground like water. His crown glimmered dimly, as though the jewels themselves feared to reflect the light. He paused. Something felt wrong. The air was too warm, the shadows too long, the silence too heavy. And then he saw the listener. The priest stood at the center of the courtyard, arms behind his back, head bowed in false humility. Around him, a circle of temple servants listened with rapt attention. Some leaned forward as though caught in a spell. Others stared blankly, as if the words passing into their ears were unfit for their minds. Matanya stood at the edge of the gathering, eyes pleading, face pale. When Solomon approached, the listener turned with a slow, deliberate grace. The chronicler writes that the king staggered, for in the priest's eyes he saw a glimmer he had once seen only in visions, the radiance of a being who had stood before God and fallen. The listener bowed. "My king." Solomon's voice trembled. "What have you done?" The listener smiled, a small, sorrowful smile like that of a man recounting a story he had long waited to tell. "What you once sought." The king's chest tightened. Memories surged. The nights he spent chasing forbidden knowledge, the hours speaking to spirits at the edge of revelation, the terrible bargain he almost struck in pursuit of understanding. He had stood on the threshold of a door heaven never meant him to open, and he had turned back, but someone else had not. The listener stepped closer. "You rejected the wisdom of the first throne. You feared its memory. I do not." Solomon's voice sharpened. "That memory was cast out for a reason." The listener tilted his head, as though weighing the king's soul. "Exile does not erase sovereignty. Only forgetfulness does." The chronicler says a shadow passed across Solomon's face, not cast by cloud or pillar, but by dread. For behind the listener he saw the faint outline of another presence, moving like heat above a fire. A presence with shape but not form, a silhouette of wings without feathers, a crown without metal, light that bent, not shone. Solomon whispered, "You let him rise." The listener answered, "He never fell as far as heaven claimed." The king raised a trembling hand. "I command you, cease whatever power you have invoked." The listener laughed softly. "You command the loyal, not the forgotten." Then he stepped aside, and the presence moved. The chronicler writes that the very stone beneath Solomon's feet grew warm. A faint hum vibrated through the courtyard, the same sound Matanya had heard beneath the temple. The king felt his heartbeat falter, his knees weaken, his breath catch in his throat. The presence was greeting him. "Solomon." The whisper crawled across the air like smoke. "You remember me." The king shut his eyes, agony tightening his jaw. He remembered. He had always remembered. The night he had sought wisdom beyond the prophets. The voice that had answered. The offer he had refused. The listener stepped forward. "It wants only what was taken, memory." Solomon whispered, "Memory becomes worship." "If the heart is weak," the listener replied. The courtyard fell silent. Only one voice broke it, quiet, trembling, full of dread. Matanya's. "My king, the chamber beneath us is weakening. The seal will not hold much longer." Solomon looked at him, eyes burning with fear and resolve. "Then we must do what even heaven feared to do." The chronicler ends this portion with a single haunting line. "For the first time since the chamber was sealed, the king sought counsel, not from spirits, nor scribes, nor prophets, but from his own trembling soul." What he decided would determine not only the fate of the temple, but the fate of the presence beneath it. The final fragment of the scroll is the most damaged, burned at the edges, as if someone tried to erase what it dared to preserve. Yet enough remains to reveal how Solomon confronted the presence beneath his sanctuary. The chronicler writes that the king dismissed the priests, the worshippers, even the guards. Only 3 remained in the courtyard as the sun vanished behind the hills: Solomon, Matanya, and the listener. The air grew still, as if creation itself held its breath. The listener stepped forward, his sigil faintly glowing. "Do not resist," he said gently. Let the first wisdom return to Israel. Solomon's voice broke like dry reeds. That is not wisdom, that is the memory of rebellion. The ground beneath them pulsed, a soft tremor like the heartbeat of something rising. Matanya seized Solomon's arm. My king, if it reaches the sanctuary fully, nothing will remain holy. The listener spread his arms. Holiness is what heaven defines, but heaven has lied. A whisper, soft, ancient, sorrowful, drifted from beneath the stone. Solomon, you sought me once. The king fell to his knees, not in worship but in anguish. I sought wisdom, he whispered, not dominion, not the shadow you became. The listener's eyes flared with golden fire. He was cast out unjustly. Will you cast him out again? The presence surged upward, a wave of heat, light, and trembling darkness. The chamber beneath them groaned. The courtyard stones cracked like thin ice. And then Matanya stepped between Solomon and the rising glow. He lifted his reed scroll, the same brittle parchment he had carried into the chamber, and struck the ground with it. The chronicler's words here are faint, and the scroll burned with a light not of this world. A pillar of white fire rose from the parchment, expanding in a sudden burst that filled the space between earth and sky. It shone so fiercely that even Solomon covered his face. The listener screamed, not in pain, but in rage. The sigil on his forehead blistered. The shadow behind him recoiled, folding inward like wings struck by judgment. Matanya's voice broke through the uproar. You are remembered, but not welcomed. The fire grew brighter. The earth shook, and beneath the temple the chamber howled, a long, wrenching cry like a star collapsing in on itself. The presence was pushed downward, forced through a narrowing gap between realms, sealed again not by stone, but by memory denied. The listener fell to the ground. The sigil burned away. The presence vanished like breath extinguished, and the temple fell silent. Matanya collapsed beside the king, the scroll in ashes at his feet. Solomon whispered, What did you give? Matanya answered with a trembling voice, Not knowledge, not blood, only forgetfulness. For the scroll had not contained wisdom, it had contained a name, a true name. And when it burned, the presence beneath the temple lost the last memory that tied it to earth. The chronicler's final line is the most haunting. Thus was the first shadow sealed, not by chains, not by kings, but by the erasure of itself, and Jerusalem slept again, unaware of how close it had come to waking something older than dawn. Below it, almost invisible, is a final note. Some stones still remember.